All right, we ready to go?
Yeah, Margaret, I don't know if we want to give a few more minutes. It looks like
Well,
the
I'm kind of
participant. Yeah,
hesitating. I see people coming in and
yeah.
just, yeah, just we'll hang in there for a few more seconds here.
As we
I don't want to take
participant
away,
number grows.
I don't want to take away from your time. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started with just a very brief, again, I don't want to take too much time away from our presenters today, but I just want to give a very big welcome to all of you who are here and are still coming in. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. We are very excited to be here today with the authors of 4 of the 9 articles in the 2025 special issue of Public Opinion Quarterly that was devoted to qualitative research. This issue, I will say, was a labor of love that began sometime before the call for papers went out in 2023. The response to the call was overwhelming. And after a thorough review process, we selected 9 articles that demonstrate a quality approach to qualitative research. Kind of a passion of mine. Just as the very last thing, I want to just give a big shout out and a very big thank you to all of the authors and all of the reviewers who went through this painstaking process. And a very, very much thank you to the authors we have here today who have taken time out of their busy schedules to spend some time with us today to discuss the articles they have in this special issue, which is very exciting. Um, big thank you for the support we received from the editors-in-chief, Allison Holbrook and Phil Jones, and of course the managing editor, Phyllis, who has now recently retired, but Phyllis Silverstein, who if anybody that knows Phyllis knows what I'm talking about. Just a wonderful person to work with. As everybody was to work with. Just tremendous support we received, and just thank you, thank you, thank you. So enough of me. I'm going to turn this over to Zach Smith, my co-editor, and we'll get started with hearing from the authors. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret, and thank you all for being here today to hear from our 4 author groups, our 4 articles that are presenting today. Margaret, you took all the words out of my mouth, all the thanks that I wanted to give, and more. This was truly a remarkable effort to be part of. I cannot believe both how long it took and how I think successful it has been. And that's in no small part due to the contributions of so many people. I will introduce each presenter and their article in turn. And we are going to start with Michael Schober of the New School for Social Research, who will discuss participants' reported discomfort with live video as a mode for answering a sensitive survey question. And this article was co-authored with Shlomit Okan and Rebecca S. Dolgan. Dr. Schober, take it away.
Okay, can we see slides and hear me?
We can.
Great. Okay. So, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this invitation. It was really cool to be part of this special issue. And thank you to the editors and reviewers for amazing feedback along the way. It was really helpful. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Shlomit and Rebecca. And also, oops. And now, how do I advance? There we go. Okay. Also, I want to acknowledge the co-authors on the first study in which these data were collected. This is Fred Conrad, Andrew Hupp, Callum Larson, and Irene Ong of University of Michigan, National Science Foundation, Marcy Hudson at the New School, the Qualitative Support Team, and New School Faculty Research Funds. Okay, so imagine you were asked this question in a live video survey interview.
How many sex partners have you had in the last 12 months?
Okay, that's a tough question to be asking in the first place. And our research question here was, how different would it feel being asked the same question by the interviewer in person? How different would it feel being asked the same question in a web survey? So the research questions we're addressing here in this study are the general question of how mode specific is discomfort in answering a sensitive question. In particular, what are the reasons for mode specific discomfort? So the data set we are analyzing in a qualitative way today was collected in the context of another study in which we found that people reported willingness to participate in a live video survey was predicted by how useful they perceive live video in other contexts, how much they enjoy live video in other non-survey contexts, and also how uncomfortable they reported feeling answering a survey question in video. So we were curious to know, what is it about live video relative to other survey modes that leads to mode-specific discomfort? So the data set in this study, we had 598 online participants who rated their discomfort answering the same sensitive question in a hypothetical survey in 5 modes. There was live video, there was in-person, there was phone, there was a mode we'll call pre-recorded video. That's a web survey in which respondents play embedded video of interviewers reading the questions, and a traditional text-only web survey. These other modes differ from live video in theoretically and practically important ways. In particular, 3 are interviewer administered, 2 are self-administered. In some modes, the interviewer's behavior is responsive to what the respondent does. Only in person are the interviewer and the participants physically co-present, and you have a facial representation of the interviewer in 3 of the different modes. And there are a number of other differences between the modes that are potentially theoretically and practically of interest. So as we see it, these and more mode differences plausibly contribute to differing feelings of connection, or what's been called social presence, with the interviewer. And these differences have been hypothesized to help explain previously observed mode differences in disclosure. So for example, evidence from a while ago that the presence of even a low-resolution animated interviewer's face can reduce disclosure relative to an audio-only web survey just as much as a live interviewer with the very same voice. So our data set allows exploration of how feelings of social presence might be predictors of video, or might connect with video-specific discomfort. So the sensitive question is the one you heard at the start. How many sex partners do you have in the last 12 months? We selected this question as an exemplar of a sensitive question that will lead most respondents into an uncomfortable situation based on prior rating studies. So most respondents judge the topic as something that is uncomfortable for most people to be asked, and every single potential answer to this question, it was rated as uncomfortable for many people to give. So asking our respondents to rate how they would feel being asked the very same sensitive question in all 5 modes allows us to focus on the effect of mode on discomfort, because we're controlling the content of the sensitive question. So in our online survey, the questions about discomfort looked like this. So imagine you were asked this question by a live interview over a video app like Zoom, FaceTime, or Skype. You play the video.
Sex partners have you had in the last 12 months?
And you need to judge on a scale from 1 to 5, very uncomfortable to completely uncomfortable, how you feel about answering that. Okay. And we had alternate versions for each of the different mode comparisons. And respondents were presented with these questions, different respondents in different orders, using Qualtrics's randomization feature. So comparing how would you feel on the phone, how would you feel on video relative to in person, et cetera. Okay. The part that allowed us to do what we think were the interesting qualitative explorations here was, after people had given their ratings, they were asked in an open-ended way to say, according to the judgments you made a moment ago, you indicated that you would feel depending on what their answer had been, more uncomfortable answering the question about sex partners in an in-person interview than in a live video interviewer. And we asked people in an open-ended text field to say, why did you answer that way? Okay. And so we have alternate versions of this depending on how people had answered their rating scales. If somebody was equally comfortable in video than everything else, they wouldn't get any of these questions. And if somebody had been, differently comfortable in live video versus other modes, they would get different versions of these questions. So our participants in the original study were 598 participants, online panelists recruited by Applied Research, with demographics targeted to match 2018 CPS distributions on age, gender, education, and race ethnicity. The overall ratings that we saw before about discomfort were live video and in person were both rated as equally uncomfortable to answer this question in. Live video was more uncomfortable than phone, more uncomfortable than pre-recorded video, and web survey was the least uncomfortable. So that's the backdrop to our qualitative analyses. So for the qualitative analyses, we had 598 participants in our total data set, which we had 369 participants who had open-ended text comments we could look at because we had 229 folks who said they were equally comfortable in live video compared to all the other modes, or equally uncomfortable. Out of the 369 participants, we had 262 who produced 530 codable responses. And of these, 110 were codable as being about less discomfort in live video, 420 were codable as being about more discomfort in live video. So this was our sort of filtering to get to the data set for coding. Of the 530 responses, more than 2/3 were explanations for having rated feeling more discomfort in live video than in the other modes, and less than 1/3 were explanations for feeling less discomfort in live video than in the other modes. But I should point out that there were participants in our data set who, with every single possible comparison, felt video was more uncomfortable, and other participants who felt that video was less uncomfortable or more comfortable. All right, so with this data set of open-ended responses, we found 7 predominant content categories with 102 responses reflecting more than one category. So we had a total of 632 assigned codes. The codes were assigned based on what was explicitly stated rather than what might be inferable, which was, of course, a temptation. So we were trying to be really rigorous about how to do that. We had 350 responses that had to be excluded as irrelevant, inclusive, or not matching the discomfort. So people who just wrote no comment or no particular reason, we can't do much with what they answered. We ended up with very nice high coding reliability, even with the most stringent ways of considering what a mismatch by coders would be. So we felt confident that our codes made sense and that the rules we had followed in coding were reasonable. So the categories included social co-presence or the lack of it. These are responses that focus on connection or lack of connection between the respondent and interviewer. And here are some examples of actual text that from the responses that we used to code. The paper has more examples that one can look at in more detail. There were responses that were about visual co-presence, seeing or being seen. There were responses that talked about their feelings about the interaction, judgment, vulnerability, shyness, social anxiety, nervousness. We had comments about anonymity, privacy, or surveillance concerns, so worries about being recorded or whether someone else can hear what you're saying. We had comments about sensory health or physical safety concerns, like not wanting a stranger in your home. Some people feeling better about being on video because of hearing issues, COVID concerns, etc. We also had a number of responses that were about general mode preference that were what people said, but that weren't particularly informative because it doesn't say why particular discomfort with this question. And then also some people who just said it's nobody's business, which does not distinguish between why video versus the other modes. But we included these categories because people said it. Okay, and if we look at, so the data set we have allows a number of, I think, sort of intriguing analyses with the full caveat understanding this is not a representative sample, and the way people responded and the way we set it up doesn't allow real quantification of how many people in a general population would have exactly this opinion, but rather a different way of looking at the data. But we did see real differences in among the folks who said that they were less uncomfortable in live video than in another mode, that there were, depending on the mode of comparison, there were different issues that came up more. So for in-person feelings about the interaction, some people really liked in a live video compared to in-person because there's a barrier between them and the person on the screen, and that increases their comfort. For phone, real focus on seeing and being seen. In pre-recorded video, there was some folks who felt very odd about looking at a camera with a video instead of a real person on the other end. If we look at the reasons that people gave for greater discomfort in live video, we saw that there were compared to in-person, the biggest set of reasons were about anonymity, privacy, surveillance, that video seems less secure and potentially could be recorded secretly. I wouldn't know who else could hear my answers. Again, with phone, visual co-presence, but this time on the other end, right, where compared to the people who were glad about not being seen. In the other case, here there are people who they're glad they can't be seen. On the other end, there are people who want to be seen. Okay, so you can see that there are some examples of these kinds of things. The paper has a lot more of them in there. We were really intrigued that the additional concerns that we saw were different from and went beyond what we have seen in prior theorizing about mode-specific discomfort. I had not yet, or none of us had seen before, stuff or comments or feelings or concerns about recordability of an interview and thus the identifiability of the respondents. We had not seen before worry about the risk of being heard by others while answering. And that's interesting that it's coming up in video, and it's sort of just as true in phone, at least for one side of the conversation, but somehow video sort of highlighted for some respondents that others could hear in a very different way. And maybe they're thinking of their video setup in particular as being a piece of the story. Also have not seen before ease of break-off of being a real issue, that for some people, and maybe this is based on their live video experience in other contexts, knowing that they can disconnect as opposed to awkwardly walk out was really interesting. It feels like in person there is no escape, and in video there's the potential for escape. So we found this very intriguing. We also saw some nuances of features that we have not seen before in prior featural analyses of different modes of interviewing and sensitive questions and concerns. So we saw a really interesting distinction where some folks were really focusing on being seen, either as a positive or a negative. So some people wanted to be seen and felt like they couldn't answer that without being seen, and others felt in the other direction, they couldn't possibly answer that if they are being seen by the interviewer. And there were other participants who focused on what it meant to see the interviewer. So with seeing as a negative, it seems more personal when you're looking at somebody, so they're worrying about the reaction on the interviewer's side. And on others, for other participants, seeing was a positive, that I want to be able to see the person that I'm looking at when I disclose this information. So that was new for us, that there are these alternate versions of what the very same feature leads to in how people feel about things. Our data set also, because we have these ratings that contextualize what the open-ended text means, we can look at the difference between those who gave very extreme differences in their ratings between video and another mode, and those who gave minor little differences between. And looking at those extremities seemed like this will be informative about those who are particularly uncomfortable in what they think about. And our data set allows some analyses and quantification, again, with all the caveats about quantification that we are really mindful of, that participants with extreme discomfort in live video versus in person tended to be older, low-frequency users who reported not liking live video in other contexts. Participants with extreme discomfort in live video versus web were twice as likely to identify as male and to rate video in other contexts as less useful and enjoyable, but they also reported higher than average video use and using it mostly for work or education. Those with extreme relative discomfort in live video versus pre-recorded video were mostly female-identified infrequent users who use live video in personal context. Again, with all the caveats about quantification, to us, this kind of analysis opens the door to new hypotheses and tests using other methods to see to what extent and in what ways there are these different subpopulations who have different ways of feeling about video interaction and how that might apply to a survey setting and an uncomfortable question. We were also really intrigued that, and I haven't seen this in the literature before, that different people could give the very same reasons for being more or less relatively uncomfortable in live video versus the other modes. So there were people who felt judged, and so they want a technology barrier and feel that video is great for that. Or others who want more human connection so that they can feel more comfortable along the way. And therefore video is good. Or some people who wanted to know who is asking and who is seeing them, and others who don't want to know who is asking and prefer anonymity in that way. So I feel like these qualitative analyses open the door to looking at subpopulations within our sample in different ways than we had seen before. So we see a number of benefits of this method, and there are a number of drawbacks. It's far from perfect, but the method in particular does not allow the back and forth of delving into participants' thinking that smaller scale qualitative methods would have allowed, right? We have single texts from individuals that we are not going back to ask more about. And, but it does elicit, or we can think about as crowdsourcing, a range of thinking across a larger field of potential participants than smaller scale qualitative methods or focus groups or cognitive interviews would allow. And another thing we think was a real benefit of this approach is it does it in the context of ratings that these participants have provided before that help contextualize and clarify the meaning of their open-ended responses. There were definitely some responses where just reading the text, you wouldn't be sure what they meant. But when you see that it is about a particular disparity in rating between video and something else, suddenly it makes perfect sense what they said, and we can code accordingly. So what are we seeing? That across the modes, the top reasons that people gave for feeling more and less discomfort for the same censored question in live video included anonymity, privacy, or surveillance concerns, their feelings about the interaction and about particularly feeling judged, that general mode preference in other contexts did make a difference and was a piece of the story for some. And this feeling of social co-presence or connection was a significant theme, and interestingly, sometimes in the opposite direction, with some people reporting that they really want more presence and others wanting less presence so that they feel more comfortable divulging sensitive information. What we're seeing is that on average, people report being as uncomfortable in live video as in person, and more uncomfortable in video than in the other modes, but we also saw huge individual variability, and our approach allows us to start documenting that. This should not have been a surprise to us, but what we saw that people's perspectives on these modes of interaction may differ from researchers. Again, that shouldn't be a surprise, but we got a lot of evidence about that. We were intrigued that some respondents, based on their comments, seemed to have pretty nuanced theories of layers of social distance and what in-person versus having a video barrier versus an audio-only interaction versus text-only. They were sort of interestingly sophisticated in thinking about those differences. Really notable in this data set was that the very same features of video lead some people to feel more discomfort and others less. That seems something new and important to really think about. We know our data set raises just as many questions as it answers. So would these findings of mode-specific discomfort replicate with other equally sensitive questions or less sensitive questions? So for example, a sensitive topic that has a much less likelihood of an embarrassing response, would that change how people feel? Would it replicate with populations who are less used to participating in online panels or web surveys? Our recruitment method led to people who were regularly participating in online studies and panels, and that's a particular subset of the population. To what extent are their feelings about video versus web different from those of others? How would it replicate with probability samples, since ours definitely was not that, and for different demographic subgroups? And how would this mode-specific discomfort idea replicate with other socially distant modes of interaction that are emerging in various ways? Also, we should note the questions were about a hypothetical survey. Would the reasons given for discomfort in hypothetical surveys loom as large or larger in actual surveys? We tried to make this as realistic as possible by showing videos of what it would look like so people could experience and feel what it might feel like to be asked this question in each of the modes. But that's still not quite the same as actually being asked the question and having to give an answer. But we think the findings open the door to really thinking about mode-specific discomfort in a way that we haven't seen talked about so much before. We hypothesize that mode-specific discomfort may play a larger role in survey response and non-response than we've understood thus far. And we see a lot of reasons that it would be a good idea to try to understand this better. It could help in diagnosing willingness to participate in surveys at all, learning more about how mode effects arise and potentially adjusting for them, understanding which modes to offer as part of a survey suite for which populations, for developing instructions or interventions that could reduce concerns about disclosing information in a particular mode, and for developing new versions of modes that maximize or minimize particular reasons for discomfort. As we see it, video has now highlighted the possibility of seeing and being seen and how disentangleable those are, that open new doors for thinking about how one might administer surveys that deal with sensitive topics that could be tailored for the comfort levels of different participants in a way that one would hope would improve everyone's comfort and standardize that, as opposed to standardizing the stimulus but leaving comfort to go all over the place. So particularly, we think that as new modes of interaction are becoming more prevalent, it's going to become more important to understand how and when survey-specific mode discomfort connects with discomfort in other arenas of interaction, like telemedicine or business meetings or job interviews or family interactions, which are so different from a survey interview in which a stranger is asking you an intrusive question. Or alternatively, is survey mode discomfort specific to the survey situation of a stranger asking intrusive questions for data collection purposes? All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm already seeing questions come in the Q&A. We are going to do Q&A at the end of everyone's presentation. And so without further ado, let's go on to Marieke Haan of the University of Groningen, Netherlands, presenting on using a blended approach to thematic analysis, a case study on fatherhood and imprisonment. This piece was co-authored with Simon D. Venema. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. I'll try to share. Okay. Is the presentation visible? And can you hear me well?
Yes, it is.
Great. Okay. Yes. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. Today I will give a broad overview of the paper that I wrote together with Simon. For details, you can read the paper itself. It contains a lot of details, which are not very suitable for this presentation. So I keep it a bit broad on purpose. And in this paper, we present what we call a blended approach to thematic analysis. And why this paper? Well, it's actually started from a practical challenge in our own work. When we conducted our analyses, we realized that we were actually doing what we were doing did not fully align with any of the established frameworks for thematic analysis. So there we run into some kind of problem. Also, we noticed that in the literature of Brown and Clark, their 2006 paper is often cited as a default reference point, even when analytical practices differ quite substantially from what is described there. So there's some kind of gap between what researchers claim to do and what the actual approach is saying. And then the last point, and this last point strongly connects to what Brown and Clark wrote in their 2021 paper, in which they say that approaches are combined in practice. So you see it in a paper, but the tensions that come with combining approaches are often not discussed in papers or are not even recognized. So people say they are doing thematic analysis, but do not really carefully explain how they did it, which approach they took, etc. And I think this also connects to a broader issue when doing research, that there's a gap between like these ideal methodological descriptions and real world analytical practice, which sometimes differs from what the approach is telling you to do, or just because maybe your data does not connect exactly to the approach that is described in the literature. So what we want to do in this paper is to make those real practices more explicit, especially since they involve combining or blending different thematic analysis approaches. So our paper had three main aims. First, we want to conceptualize what a blended approach to thematic analysis actually is. Some papers suggest that thematic analysis approaches can be mixed, but what this exactly entails remains somewhat unclear to us. So we were looking for that ourselves in literature, and now we tried to describe that in this paper. So we hope this will help other researchers when they are looking for such a blended approach. Second, we want to demonstrate how blending works in practice using a concrete case. And third, we want to increase transparency. I think this is in general very important, but we want to show how we describe our analytical decisions for the chosen blended approach. So people could also, use that approach or use the steps that we took, that they have good examples of that. Well, the starting point when talking about a blended approach is that thematic analysis is not one single method, but a collection of approaches with different assumptions, so different research assumptions. So how you think of your research project being more like counting codes, or do you want to use them more as subjectively discussing the codes without counting them and then developing themes. So there are different assumptions on how to handle the data and how you want to use thematic analysis. Well, there are like three main approaches described in the literature. Those are called coding reliability, codebook TA, and reflexive thematic analysis approaches. For example, codebook approaches tend to emphasize structure, consistency, and teamwork, whereas reflexive approaches emphasize interpretation, subjectivity, and the active role of the researcher. And not always do these research projects fit neatly into one of these three approaches. And this is where we see value in a blended approach. Our key point is that the choice of method should follow the research question and the research aims you have as a researcher. And that when you decide to combine thematic analysis elements, the combination should be well justified. So we apply a blended thematic analysis approach to a study on fatherhood in prison based on 39 semi-structured interviews with imprisoned fathers. The dataset included two groups. It's based on the Venema 2024 paper. And so the dataset included two groups: fathers who participated in the family program. So imprisoned fathers who had a family who behaved well and then could participate in this family program. And we had a comparison group with also imprisoned fathers, but who were not in that particular program. So this allowed us not only to explore experience of these fathers in depth, but also to make comparisons between these two groups of fathers. Well, and our analytical process followed Brown and Clark's 6-phase frameworks, which belongs essentially to their reflexive approach. So this is already one point I want to make clear, is that in many papers that we have read about thematic analysis is that the phases of Brown and Clark are applied, but then a different approach to thematic analysis is taken. So not a reflexive approach, which is their approach, but another approach. And people do not recognize that in their papers. Well, and we did. And well, in this analysis, we move back and forth between phases of the thematic analysis. So reading transcripts, coding, refining themes, and revisiting earlier interpretations, which can also be connected to what is called an organic process in reflexive approaches. So it's an iterative process. You go back and forth between those phases until you have generated the themes that you really, well, that you have analyzed in your data. Though we also have structured elements like a shared codebook and team discussions. And this also added a level of consistency that makes this process more systematic and traceable. And this part of our approach very much connects to codebook thematic analysis approaches. So we combined actually reflexive thematic analysis approaches with codebook thematic analysis approaches. And that's what I show here on this slide. Well, so in the analytical process, we combined the structured codebook driven techniques with more flexible, reflexive thematic analysis practices. And yeah, we combined this in one coherent workflow. At the outset, a theory-informed codebook was developed by us based on existing literature on fatherhood and imprisonment, and it was also based on our research question that we have for the more applied paper that we wrote about this. This provided a set of initial categories and codes that guided early data engagement, and coding was conducted collaboratively by multiple researchers, with regular discussions to align interpretations and ensure consistency. And although formal reliability metrics were not applied, so we did not use statistics to test the coherence of our codes. These conversations supported a shared understanding of the data and also strengthened the interpretative rigor. Yeah, the predefined codes were then systematically applied across all 39 interviews to maintain consistency in the analysis within the research team. And as the analysis progressed, more reflexive elements were introduced. So codes were not treated as fixed. Instead, they evolved. They evolved. So we got new insights from the data, and then our codes changed. So the research focus was iteratively following an organic process inspired by the phases of Brown and Clark. And throughout this process, analytical memos and team dialogues played also a key role in documenting our decisions, underlying assumptions, and shifts in thinking. And in addition, the researchers we continuously reflected on our own positionality and considering how our perspectives and roles influence the interpretation of the data. One example of that, for example, is that the fathers in prison said they were very much connected to their children, but then if we asked them about details about how they played with the children and if they know about the schedule of their children, where they went to school, they could not really answer those questions. But to them, the involvement they found very valuable was that they gave presents to their children and that they gave money to support them somehow from the prison. And to us, that did not really mean that they were involved, but to them it did. So you have to be very careful if you then code the data and that you take into account how they are thinking and where you are coming from and how that affects also your analysis. So this is one of the examples that I have from the data itself. Together these elements formed our blended TA approach, in which structured coding ensured consistency and transparency, while reflexive practices enabled depth and flexibility, critical engagement with the data, it led to this iterative analytical process that I told you about. The result of this process is a set of themes that go beyond simply summarizing the topics. Instead, they capture patterns of meaning across participants. In the paper, we show details of our research process on how we derived at the final themes. And we started with very broad names based more on the topics from the interview guide that we used. Then in the intermediate stage, we generated 5 themes that captured important topics in the data. However, in the final stages, we realized that the differences between the 2 groups were so important that we needed to mention these in all the theme names. So these names were also iteratively developed and are grounded in the data. And while the titles of the themes are very clear and formal, which often connects more to the themes created in codebook approaches, so those that you can see in the final stage, we actually strive for describing very detailed and rich themes, not only summaries, which is more in line with reflexive TA approaches. So this is what they also described in the paper. And then we come to the strengths and challenges of blending in general and also of our approach. I think one of the main strengths of our approach is that it combines systematic coding with interpretive depth. This is particularly useful in team-based research. And in our case, it was also very helpful to make comparisons across the groups that we had in the data. And this way, we could create rich themes about the data itself. And further, we hope that we showed that by explicitly document how codes and themes are developed, blended approaches can be clearly justified, which is important, of course, for assessing the quality of qualitative research. And at the same time, challenges remain. It is also a bit, you have to be careful when you present such a blended approach, because people can also start using it without justifying it. So we warned people for this in the paper. The approach requires careful consideration of underlying assumptions, what we might call epistemological coherence. Also, justification of all choices can be a tough process, but of course very necessary. And finally, it requires more reflexivity and documentation than following an established thematic analysis approach. To conclude, I have 4 main takeaways. First, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to thematic analysis. Methods should fit the research question and the study goals, and this key takeaway also connects to a paper that Brown and Clark wrote earlier about thematic analysis, and this is what we find in our research as well. Second, blending approaches can be valuable, for example, when combining structure with interpretative depth. But this should be justified at all times. So how did you do your blended approach? Why did you choose not an established approach, but why did you choose for blending? And also then third, transparency is essential. Just like in quantitative research, clearly documenting analytical decisions really helps the credibility of the findings, and it shows what you did to other researchers, of course. And finally, reflexivity turned out to be a very important part of our research process for the coding, for the theme creating. And I believe this is important for any research project, qualitative as well as quantitative. This was my talk. And if you want to read more about thematic analysis yourself, you can find some reference here. And of course, also in the paper itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Han. I'm looking forward to the Q&A later where we can engage more. We'll now turn to Robin Kaplan and Twanquilla Walker of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Office of Survey Methods Research, who will present their article, Beyond Functional Limitations, a Multi-Methodological Approach to Questionnaire Pretesting of New Disability Measures, co-authored with Rebecca L. Morrison. And so please take it away.
Thank you, Zach. Hello, everyone. Today, Robin Kaplan and I are presenting our study on a multi-methodological approach to questionnaire pretesting of new disability measures. And as Zach mentioned, this work was conducted at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics with our colleague, Rebecca Morrison. In the U.S. federal statistical system, disabilities are usually measured by using functional limitations, and this usually happens using a series of 6 yes/no questions. And these questions ask if a person has serious difficulty with hearing, seeing, mobility, cognition, mental health, or physical health. And these questions are, for example, are you deaf, or do you have serious difficulty hearing? Do you have difficulty dressing or bathing? And if a respondent responds yes to any of these questions, it indicates that that person has a disability. However, because disabilities vary in severity and they may be permanent or they may be temporary, these questions may not fully capture the prevalence of disabilities in the working age population. To conduct our study, we used the Current Population Survey, or CPS. CPS is a U.S. household labor force survey that measures employment and unemployment in the United States. It is also interviewer administered. Occasionally, the CPS will include supplements on special topics, such as disability. And in this case, the goal of the disability supplement was to measure the employment of persons with disabilities, their work history, barriers to employment, and workplace accommodations. For the 2024 supplement, we looked at the type of disability in addition to the 6 functional limitations. In our research, we discovered that the type of disability is usually not recorded. There's only a focus on the functional limitations. There also isn't a consensus on how to collect the data or how to code the responses. For example, for some surveys, there are open-ended questions, and these responses are interviewer coded. In other surveys, respondents are asked if a doctor has provided them with a medical diagnosis or if their condition is a physical or a mental health condition. Here is the disability classification question that we used in this study. What impairment or health condition most limits the kind or amount of paid work you could do? Respondents could choose from 8 options, from 1, deafness or difficulty hearing, 2, blindness or other difficulty seeing, all the way to number 8, other conditions not mentioned. This question was interview administered, and there were no show cards to mimic the telephone interview. In testing these new disability measures, our goals were to analyze construct validity, examine if there were any issues with the response process, and also look at the difficulty or sensitivity of the questions. To do this, we used an iterative mixed methods approach, and we assessed what each method contributed to the findings. We also analyzed what would have been missed if only one pretesting method had been used. We conducted 3 rounds of testing. In rounds 1 and 2, we conducted cognitive interviews, and these interviews lasted about 60 minutes. During debriefing, we used retrospective probes to assess comprehension, recall, judgment, and response formation. After the debriefing, participants participated in a closed-ended card sort task, and they were asked to sort different conditions into the 8 categories that I showed you earlier. In round 3, we conducted a web probing study. This was a self-administered instrument. It took about 50 minutes to complete, and we included a mix of closed and open-ended probes. In the cognitive interviews, there were 40 participants, and they were recruited from online bulletin boards and from community listservs. These participants were pre-screened for chronic health conditions or disabilities. And for the web probing study, there were 390 participants. They were recruited from a non-probability web panel, and we targeted participants with chronic health conditions or disabilities. And in all rounds of the study, we included participants who were employed and also not employed. So here are the results from round 1. The cognitive interviews revealed that participants had difficulties with these categories. Particularly, there was not an option to say, I don't know. Participants also said that there were too many categories. They wanted to choose more than one category. They weren't sure where their disability fit among these categories. They also said they weren't sure if they should include minor impairments such as astigmatism. And other participants said that the category they were looking for simply was not there. So we've categorized these difficulties as no item, non-response, response selection, distinguishing between categories, lack of specificity, and lack of presence. For the card sort task, participants were asked to sort 20 health conditions into those 8 categories. And here on the screen is a screenshot of what participants saw during the card sort. Similar to the results of the cognitive interviews, we noticed that participants had difficulties with this task. 35% of the conditions were categorized as chronic conditions, and 22.9% were categorized as other conditions not mentioned. Participants used chronic conditions as a catch-all, and they used other when they weren't sure of what the condition was. Here is a snapshot of how participants categorized those health conditions. So in the first column, those are the health conditions, and then at the top in the first row, those are some of the categories. And what we notice is that even for some common conditions like amputation and asthma, participants did not consistently sort those into similar categories. And for conditions like fibromyalgia, participants just weren't sure of what that condition was. In contrast, for conditions like arthritis and depression, participants found those easier to sort, and there was 100% agreement for those conditions. Now I will turn it over to Robin to present the results from rounds 2 and 3.
Thanks, Tonquilla. I'm going to go over the results from round 2. So to address the issues that we found in round 1 of testing, we revised and simplified the number of categories from 8 down to 5. We dropped that chronic condition since that seemed to be the sort of catch-all category. And we also removed the example names from the categories themselves and had those turn into read if necessary examples for interviewers to read aloud if participants expressed confusion or needed some more examples of what those conditions were. Next slide, please. Thanks. So going on to the results from the cognitive interviews, we found that using these streamlined categories, there were definitely fewer problems observed compared to round 1, but some issues still remained, and these seemed to be related to response selection and then distinguishing between some of the categories. So a lot of participants told us that they would like to choose multiple categories. If you recall, this was a select all one question. So they wanted to select multiple to capture the totality of their situation. And then for certain conditions, it was again somewhat ambiguous which category it would fall into. So things like ADHD could go into multiple categories, and as well as asthma. So those were the main problems we observed in the second round, but overall an improvement from the first round. Next slide, please. So moving on to the card sort findings. So we use new categories and different health conditions in round 2 to see how these streamlined categories performed, and participants indicated that they were more easily able to sort the conditions into the available categories compared to round one. So that was a positive finding. And as you can see, the responses were more evenly distributed as well compared to round one. So that indicated that people were having an easier time sorting them. Next slide, please. So going on to the card sort results for round two, looking at the detailed findings. So participants again indicated some of the conditions could be sorted into multiple categories. This was particularly true, as you can see, with Alzheimer's and dementia. People sorted those into various categories, but then others had 100% agreement, like anxiety disorder, dyslexia, or headaches. So that gave us some more data on which categories were really easy for people to sort versus ones that were more ambiguous. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the findings from the web probing study. So this study was designed to be as similar as possible to our cognitive interview study, but just in a self-administered online format. So we had really low item non-response to the disability classification question, only about 3%. That told us participants were willing and able to provide this information to us. But then we administered a closed-ended probe asking them how difficult it was for them to answer that question. This was on a 5-point unipolar scale. So those who indicated that they had some difficulty answering the question were given a follow-up open-ended probe asking for the reasons why the question was difficult for them to answer. And again, we saw similar findings to the cognitive interview study. So participants wanted to select multiple answers, difficulty selecting just one, trouble deciding if their mental or physical health condition impaired them more. And then this last quote, I think, is really poignant and sums up a lot of the themes that we saw in the open ends. Often when someone is unable to work due to disability, there are multiple conditions that feed off of each other. It can be difficult to decide which is the most limiting. Next slide, please. So on investigating this open end about difficulty, we found some of the responses weren't actually related to difficulty per se, but were related to sensitivity. And this really surprised us because in the literature, we know a lot of times doing an anonymous web survey can reduce sensitivity, but we actually saw the opposite finding here where there was very little sensitivity in our cognitive interviews. But we did see more of this willingness to admit the question was sensitive in the web mode. So people said things like, I don't like to admit I have weaknesses, or were willing to talk about their traumatic experiences related to their health condition, or that it's difficult to talk or write about it, or that they don't want to discuss their health with strangers online, and just feeling that it was really vulnerable for them. So this was a unique finding that we only saw in the web survey and not the other modes we tested. Okay, next slide, please. So to summarize, we found that it was feasible to collect the type of disability in a survey, which was a big change from how disability is typically collected for federal surveys. And we found participants did seem willing and able to report on the type of disability that they had in the categories that we provided to them. And all three of the methods that we used supported the following recommendations, which were implemented into the survey. So providing simplified, streamlined categories that are easy to understand, allowing for selection of multiple conditions, and providing examples of each category that would really help distinguish each of those categories from one another, and that would range in severity. Some limitations were that participants reported on their subjective perceptions of their own health condition, which could vary from how a subject matter expert or medical doctor might classify their condition. And of course, this is all volunteers and a non-probability sample, so not representative of the general population. And going on back to the major theme of this work, which was our mixed methods approach, we found this to be a really valuable approach for pre-testing these questions. So the cognitive interviews really uncovered issues with comprehension and response formation, like response selection, distinguishing between the categories, or not finding the right category. And the findings really helped us refine the category names and make those understandable to respondents. And then the card sort really added a lot of information on classification of a broad range of disabilities we wouldn't have been able to test had we just done the cognitive interviews where participants report on their own health conditions. And this let us assess which of the categories were most ambiguous and which had really good agreement. So that really helped us refine those category examples for interviewers to read. And then the web probing study, we were able to replicate and extend a lot of the findings from the previous 2 studies that we did. And we also uncovered this new issue with question sensitivity. And as the current population survey and other surveys move to mixed mode with disability supplement going to the web at some point, this is something for the program to consider for the future. So if we hadn't conducted testing using these 3 methods, we would have lost out on each of these unique insights that we gained from each of them. So our takeaway is that researchers should really consider using a mixed method approach when pre-testing survey questions, especially if they involve vulnerable populations or a lot of different categories to choose from or are a sensitive topic, so that a full range of perspectives can be represented in the final survey design. All right. And this is our contact information. Thank you.
Thank you both. And we will turn to our final presenter, Melissa Scardeville of the American Institute for Research, presenting on using semi-structured interviews to better understand non-response to a government-sponsored mail-based survey of households, co-authored with Rebecca Medway, Paula Diaz, and Chris Peck. Go ahead. Thank you so much, Dr. Scardeville.
Thank you so much. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you. First, thank you so much for inviting us today. It's a real honor to be here, and special shout out to Margaret and Zach for all of your support and the reviewers who really helped shape and make this piece. As Zach noted, what I'll talk about today are what we really call our non-response study. We were following up to non-responders who were not responding to a government-sponsored mail-based household survey. So to sort of situate our study, as what most of you are probably very familiar with, survey response rates have definitely been declining. The survey in which this study focused on, the National Household Education Survey, or NHES, hasn't escaped this trend at all. So what sort of started driving this work is when we looked at the response to the screener in 2012, we had about a 74% response rate. By 2023, it was 61%. We also know that non-response on NHES and likely other surveys is not random, that non-respondents tend to be younger, less educated, and have lower incomes. That said, there's not as much that we know about people who don't respond to surveys, and what are the ways that we can get them to respond to surveys. And so we conducted this study, the non-response follow-up study, to understand these nuances and drivers. So first, just really briefly about the study in which we were following up on the non-respondents. The NHES is a large-scale cross-sectional survey sponsored by the National Center for Education and Statistics. Its goal is to collect nationally representative and descriptive data on educational activities of children and families. And just briefly how this happened in 2019 is that there was an address-based sample of more than 200,000 addressees. There was a sequential web mail protocol with a 5-page prepaid cash incentive. The screener was meant to identify households with children, and then if they were eligible, then ask the adult in that household to complete a more detailed questionnaire about that sample child. The U.S. Census Bureau collected all of the data. And so the focus of our talk today is not on the NHES per se, but trying to figure out sort of drivers of non-response to this particular study. So How do you find people that don't respond? So what we did is we did both mail, phone, and in-person recruitment across 4 U.S. cities to about 400 households that hadn't responded to the NHAS by the third mailing. And so what we first did is send an invitation letter to all of those 400 households saying that we were interested in doing a 90-minute in-person qualitative interview to better understand their thoughts about surveys. There was the sort of eligibility was, they had to have lived in the house since January of 19. That meant that they were actually there when they got the original invitations from NHAS, and that they had to have some responsibility for checking our mail. So just for time's sake, I won't go into all of the details, but always happy to follow up with questions or answers. But the end result was that we did in-person, door-to-door recruitment to and then did in-person interviews within the households of these non-responders. So we ended up doing 85 interviews in total. Of 70 of those interviews are the focus of this article. They were about 90 minutes. We did them both in English and Spanish, and they were across a variety of domains that you see on the screen. In general, we were interested in their attitudes, values, and life experiences, and trying to get a broader context to understand why they didn't respond to the NHAS. So the domains you see on the screen were driven by what literature talks about non-response. So as I said earlier, we know that non-respondents tend to have less education than responders. And so education was a domain in which we were interested in asking questions. So we conducted these interviews, transcribed them, and for the analysis process, we really focused on kind of a modified grounded theory approach that both sort of uses existing theory to drive analysis, but also sort of allows space for emergent themes to be part of sort of refining the theory of non-response. So on the screen, you see this is also in the paper, our code book. So what was bolded was a deductive code that came from our interview guide. We were a federal survey. We're going to be asking about attitudes for the government. What you see, not in bold, the code names are more the inductive codes. So for example, time use was a deductive code. We know that, having time to do surveys is related to response. But the idea of people's schedules being erratic was kind of a nuanced theme that we felt was better sort of captured in its own sort of subcode, as opposed to having kind of one large massive time use code. So in our and these are also supplementary materials in the article itself. It kind of walks through what our codebook was, not only the code and type, but the description, and also kind of an example for when we were training coders on what to look for when they were coding. So moving on to results, our article focused on 3 domains: time use, attitudes towards government, and privacy concerns. We chose these because these were very robust and prevalent across multiple of the interviews, and also we thought that the results actually are quite nuanced and have a lot of implications not only for NHAS, but surveys in general. So in the article, as well as today, I'll sort of walk through the findings in terms of the existing literature, and then to kind of discuss the implications for survey participation. So first with time use. So while there is differing research on how people are actually spending their time, there is a growing consensus that actually people feel really busy. So even if their calendar doesn't necessarily represent that, when you ask people how they're doing, oh, I'm really busy. So we were asking in the study, well, how do you spend your time? And what we found is people often describing themselves as busy. And I'll pause here and say, we didn't go in, our interview guide were purposely very, very broad questions of how do you spend your day. We weren't looking to sort of say, you feel really busy, right? Obviously, that isn't how you conduct qualitative. You really want to be able to understand a participant from his or her or their own experience. So it really started very broadly of like, tell me how you spent a typical day. And within those narratives, when they would describe their typical day, they would say in their own words, describing themselves as very busy, not having time, being very exhausted. Many people talked about having really challenging work schedules, having really long commutes, having to get up early, also having a lot of family obligations, taking care of older relatives, taking care of children, many times doing both. And so that in a combination of work, that they were spending their days doing all these obligations. So on the screen, for the sake of time, I won't read them all, but we sort of have an illustrative quote that sort of talks about, kind of represents what some people were talking about with time use. And really people were, their list was a sense of obligations, and then doing a survey was just not part of them. What was really interesting is that many people actually recalled receiving the invitations in the mail, and some of them had intentions to do it and then just got too busy. And some of them saw it and said, oh, I have absolutely no, time to do this. So it was interesting to us is that people explicitly talked about, it wasn't just us saying, inferring that busyness, people explicitly talked about of like, yeah, I remember getting this piece of mail. I remember looking at it, putting to the side and intending to go back to it. And I just got really busy. Another sort of implication for surveys too is that, we all spend a lot of time and energy in crafting the best ask in all of our materials. And yet we found that not everyone really reads them very closely. They really sort of skim it looking for the ask. And so thinking through implications for survey design and recruitment design of also understanding through cognitive interviews what sort of the immediate takeaways that someone has if they're skimming. So we also asked about sort of attitudes towards government. And again, this was just sort of very asked in very broad terms of, what are your thoughts about the government? We had this on the original protocol because literature has shown that confidence or trust in government has been decreasing in recent decades. And because this was a federally funded survey about schools, which for many people, the schools receive some federal funding, we thought this could potentially be a domain that is affecting non-response. So in general, almost no one shared positive views, and this was sort of across the political spectrum. This was in 2019. A few shared neutral views, or just that they didn't pay attention to politics, but most really felt very disenchanted with the whole political process and government in general. Their actual grievances did differ. Some felt that the government was just too large and too inefficient. Others felt that government interfered way too much in their lives. And so, of course, why would they do a survey if the government's already interfering? Others felt that they didn't see themselves represented by government and that they felt very disconnected from it and that their voice wasn't represented or heard. And then also people feeling that government was really more like a big business and driven more by greed and not public interest. And again, these aren't discrete categories. Many people held, many of these beliefs simultaneously. So when we talk about our implication through surveys, it kind of fell into a couple of buckets. Some people, even if they were not the biggest fans of governments, they did understand the why. They understood, government needs to know what we're doing. In order for them to make decisions, they have to have data, so they have to ask about it. So we're okay with federal surveys, we understand. That said, a lot of people who had concerns about the government collecting info through surveys, what was really driving them was not knowing how the government would use the information, or that they would use it for the government's own purposes, not the purposes of the individual who filled out that survey. So there was just a deep distrust that the information they provided would honestly be either not helpful or just used against them in some way. Others felt that it really doesn't make any sense to fill government surveys because they have done them before and nothing ever changes. And so why are they going to waste their 10 minutes filling out a survey when nothing good ever comes from their actions? So again, sort of a multi-layered nuance perspective. And I'll also say, these also weren't mutually exclusive. Some people could hold multiple of these beliefs at the same time. And so there were kind of multiple drivers around government that affected survey use. Then our final topic that we'll talk about today is privacy concerns. And this is no surprise, and it's just gotten more and more in the news since we did this study in 2019. But that in general, people are very concerned about their privacy and data safeguarding, and that putting their information on a web-based survey or on a paper survey, that there could be data breaches. They don't know what happens to their data. The privacy were actually incredibly fascinating conversations to have with participants. There was an incredible range of concerns about privacy. There was one gentleman who bleached and then burned all of his mail in order to make sure he stayed off the grid. All the way to the other point where people felt that there's so many privacy violations, there actually is no privacy anymore. So it doesn't really matter whether they fill things out or not. The data's already out there. So we thought that was a really interesting driver in that there were people who, because their privacy concerns for not filling out a survey weren't because, they're going to take these data and who knows what's going to happen to them. It was that, well, why are they even asking me? They already know information. They can just buy it off the web. And so why are they wasting their time, asking me information they already know? There was a very deep belief there's a lot of coordination within the government. And so if the IRS had this data, why didn't the Department of Ed have this data? And why didn't Health and Human Services? Like, they assumed that all of this data was sort of stored in one place, and they felt almost offended. And another representation of inefficient government, that the government was asking them for things that they already knew. Finally, the way that people talked about privacy kind of clustered around two themes. One, I think is, we kind of expected, kind of protecting your own personal information, and doing that through a variety of means. But the other types of privacy was a bit more of a conceptual privacy around like maintaining distance or boundaries. It wasn't necessarily about having access to information, but just wanting to have no connection to others or no connection to the federal government. Like, really, like, having privacy meant, fences sort of around their family. So it was both sort of very conceptual and very logistical in terms of information. And again, these weren't necessarily mutually exclusive. There were some people who had one or the other. There were a few people who had neither, and there were quite a few that it was kind of overlapping in terms of how they talked about privacy. So in terms of kind of our implication for surveys, I think the first one is sort of really aligns with the literature, and I think what we kind of a gut check of, people don't want to put their personal information out there because they think it could be stolen or used in other ways. And the survey, and has, like many surveys, has information on the FAQ about the privacy, all the data privacy and security and so forth. And when asked about it, participants tended either to say, well, they didn't read all of that because it just looked like legal jargon, and so their eyes just skipped over it, or they just didn't believe it, of like, they're just putting that so they don't get sued, but we know that's not really true. There also was the interesting thing of that there was such an influx of surveys these days. And so this kind of combines sort of time use and privacy concerns, is that many people spoke about no matter what they did these days, they would get a survey. They would buy something at a website and it would pop up and be like, tell us about your experience. And that there were many people who didn't sort of differentiate between kind of an official ask from the federal government to do a survey and like a pop-up satisfaction survey about a product. To them, it was in the end the same. And there became a distrust about it because of phishing attempts and things like that. Like, sure, this pop-up looks like a survey, but is it really? This letter looks like it comes from the federal government, but does it really? Are they really just trying to get my information? And then finally, what I talked about in a few moments ago is one thing that I found just really fascinating is just this very deep belief that the government already knows all this information. And so it was almost comical to them, and they didn't want to play part of this charade of the government knows my social security, they know where my kids go to school, they know what my kid made on their report card, why are they asking? And so it was, sure, my information's out there. For some people that was very concerning, other people it was like, well, it is what it is. But for both of those groups, it was still, well, it's already out there, so I don't need to give them information because they already have it. So kind of wrapping up, what we found is that a lot of the domains, time use, attitudes towards government and privacy, those domains are still relevant, but people are experiencing them differently today than they did, honestly, even 5 years ago. The rapid use of technology and now AI are complicating all of our relationships with the government, relationships around time use, relationships around privacy. So on the one hand, yes, we found sort of evidence for what what past studies have found, but there's still, it still has to be updated to sort of be resonant with current days. Another point that we thought was really critical is that oftentimes when people talk about the drivers of non-response, they kind of focus on one driver and be like, all right, we know people are busy. How do we make this survey short? How do we sort of focus on this known driver to improve it? And what we found is that, like everything, it's much more complicated than that. That really for most people, there are actually multiple drivers, some of them actually conflicting, and they kind of exist on a continuum, and they aren't the same every day. That particularly for people that had really erratic schedules, a school teacher who receives a survey invitation in July, so they were much more likely to fill it out in July when they were off than they were, kind of in May when they were grading papers. And so it's sort of not only nuanced within the individual, but also within that course of an individual over a year. And so when thinking about trying to improve response rates, whether through the survey design itself or recruitment materials, our study suggests that if you kind of only focus on one domain, it could potentially backfire or kind of obscure how these factors kind of are kind of coexist and collectively shape how people view survey requests. Even with all those complexities, that doesn't mean that there's things that we can't do. For example, with the findings of this study, the NHS updated their participant webpage and FAQ insert to try to more directly address concerns around privacy and not leaning into sort of what the legal language and all of the strange marks and all of these statutes and so forth that from at least our study that people were disbelieving or not reading. So it's that there are small things that can be done, and that they should also be sort of taken into consideration of, okay, if we focus on privacy concerns, for example, are there things that when we focus on privacy concerns, we're actually increasing people's concerns about the government or something? So having those discussions as a team. Importantly, themes from this study are going to apply really broadly, and And we're not claiming that these are universal. There are also many other domains out there. And also, we would say that things have likely changed since we did this in 2019. As I noted, privacy, time, and government are not the same today as they were in 2019. So these are not meant to be a blueprint of how things should move forward, but just providing information and nuance for discussions around how to increase survey response. And so to that end, like there likely isn't sort of this one size fits all of if you do this checklist, then your response rate is automatically going to increase. Instead, we kind of frame this as a call for, the reason why to incorporate qualitative methods, such as interviews or focus groups into the survey design themselves to make sure that the materials, whether they're the instruments or the recruitment materials, really reflect the specific needs and concerns of that survey's audience. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We have a few questions in the Q&A. Melissa, I think that both of these are sitting for you. I want to just point to some of the ones that were asked of Michael and that he answered as well around demographic predictors of why more or less comfort with video, different types of sensitive questions, for example, ones with behavioral consequences like criminal behavior, and different populations and how they might understand and respond, or how they might understand the sensitivity of their response and the privacy of their data. And Michael has put in a number of responses there. I think the biggest point that maybe should be made is I encourage everybody to go read the papers. They are all free or open access, and I don't really know the distinction, but the point is you can get to them on POQ's website. And I also encourage you, many of our presenters mentioned transparency as a key theme. The supplementary material for each of these pieces is incredibly in-depth. And that's important because we want to make sure Margaret and I, as co-editors, we're very interested in furthering the transparency of our qualitative work, much as has been done in quantitative fields, but with a particular emphasis on what makes qualitative research, as Margaret opened by saying. Melissa, do you have any responses to the questions that were in the Q&A?
Sure. So for the first one, the short answer is yes, we definitely found that in the interviews. And I think that it was, whereas researchers and designers wanting to sort of lean towards more words to be clear and transparent, that it could have the opposite effect of people just not even reading it and really struggling to read. We also really found this with English speaking young adults of households with primarily Spanish speaking adults. And so one fascinating thing is that, although all of our materials are translated into Spanish, there was a belief that the Spanish was actually untrue and that it was sort of a trick. And so that the English was the real version. And so they would involve their English speaking children into like, well, what does this say? And that their English speaking children, were on a continuum of how well they spoke English. And so we were thinking, well, but we have the Spanish version. But in our interviews, many of them were saying, but we don't trust the Spanish version. So I do think that idea around the reading and also the and I think this leads into the other question about sort of the FAQs, is thinking about we often think about from a researcher's point of view of the frequently asked questions, but thinking about from the participant's point of view of what they are getting out of it. And so for I think too, and going back to the reading and the reading comprehension, for our study, since it's around schools, many people thought it was from the school itself, and so reached out to the principal to get more information about it. So again, really understanding your population and what some perceptions might be, and then trying to proactively get ahead of that. So like with the frequently asked questions, we really addressed head on of we don't have access to your data is really one of it. And I think preliminary results say that there has been a better increase, whether they're because of the frequently asked questions, we don't know. But we have seen some improvement since we've instituted some of those changes.
Thank you so much, Melissa. We may have time for one or two more questions. I actually would defer to Jason on this as to what happens to a Zoom webinar when the time is up. I don't know.
I'm not entirely sure, but we can keep going. If it gets cut off, it gets cut off.
I have a quick question. I don't think this will take for Marika. Have you explored the blended TA approach? Have you used it in another study? Are you thinking about utilizing it somewhere else, or maybe exploring more in the topic area you used it in what you presented here? Is it being used more by your team?
Well, we actually also did a study with non-respondents. So I think the previous presentation was very interesting. So we interviewed non-respondents and respondents, asked them a lot of questions. So we are planning to compare that data, so code it qualitatively. We're actually in the middle of that now.
Oh.
And I think we are again using a blended approach because we can justify that better than the existing approaches. But I think it will lean more towards a code book approach, because the answers that we got, I think, are also they are very practical, right? So privacy issues, but also why are they motivated? Are they too busy? So the answers are not very often well, sometimes they are emotional, but not that emotional when you talk about like imprisoned fathers or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So we are definitely working on that. And I hope that we can maybe also submit it to Public Opinion Quarterly again. So there will be more qualitative papers. And this one is also really connected to survey research. So, but it will take a while. But yeah, we are working on that. And thanks for that presentation and that paper. I really like it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions from our audience? See the number of participants declining, which probably means that people are getting on to their next meeting. And I want to thank everybody for spending 90 minutes of your Thursday with us. Thank you so much to the presenters, to Jason from DC-AAPOR for hosting. He's the face behind the Capitol image. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Please take a look at the articles on the special issue website. We really recommend highly reading all of them, including the ones that we're not able to present. I think we have some more events planned, Margaret, where we might be able to
Yes, we're working on it. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Stay tuned.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.